Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all. You've reached Night with the Experts. This is the monthly program of Nuclear Energy Information Service based in Chicago. We're bringing various experts on nuclear matters to you to give you an opportunity to learn from them, have a chance to ask questions and dialogue with them, and find out more about what is going on in the nuclear world. I'm Dave Kraft, Director of NEIS. We're based in Chicago, as I said. And we have a lot of exciting things coming up that we will be telling you about both now and at the end. First of all, welcome back. We haven't been together for quite a while because of the holidays. And I'm sure you'll all agree we're now in a new, brave new world. So that kind of changes things. We may have to change the title of this next month if we're still allowed to broadcast. But beyond that, I'm pleased to say that we've scheduled for next month a person and a topic which will be very current and germane. We're going to be doing a presentation on the effects of AI and data centers on energy use, which is a hot ticket item these days, coming off of a National Academy of Sciences 2-day workshop that Tim Judson, Director of NEARS, attended. We'll have a lot of useful information on that topic for you. That'll be next month, February 27th at 7 p.m. So put it in your calendars and we will welcome you when you come. Make sure to invite friends and guests as well. So I'm going to pass this off to my colleague on our board, her name, Jan Budart, who will now introduce our guest speaker for tonight. Jan, you want to take it away?
Sure. I'm going to ask Emily Strasser to introduce herself, but I want to tell you how I met her. I was at a fundraiser for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and she gave an after-dinner speech. I was really disappointed when her speech ended. It was a wonderful speech and emphasized the issues that we care about. Then The Half-Life of a Secret was for sale, so I bought it and read it, which simply increased my admiration for her talents and her humanity. Now she teaches the practice of English at Tufts University with emphasis on creative nonfiction and nuclear issues. It was lovely to meet such a fine writer. Thanks for being able to do what you do, Emily, and for doing it. So here's Emily.
Thank you so much, Jan, for the lovely introduction, and yeah, to you all for having me today. I'm excited to see so many people here and connect with y'all, and I'm honored to be here. So thank you. So I'm, as Jan said, I don't know that I need much more of an introduction, but I'm Emily Strasser, and I'm a writer and a professor, teacher of writing at Tufts University in the Boston area. This is my book, Half-Life of a Secret, which was based on about 10 years of research. I call it a deeply researched memoir, and I'm going to be talking a lot about like sort of my process of writing it and what I learned. So I won't give you a summary at this moment because we'll just get into it. So I'm gonna kind of toggle between talking sort of about the book, and then I'm going to read a few here and there, like short selections to give you a taste. It's a funny thing being a writer. Sometimes you get asked to talk about your book, and it's like I spent 10 years trying to figure out how to say the thing the way I wanted to say it, and now I have 5 minutes to say it to you. So sometimes I like to read from it because it's like, well, this is the way I thought about it and really worked to say it the way that I want to say it. So we'll do a little bit of both. So I will share my screen. I have a little PowerPoint here. So let's see. And oop, that's the end. All right. Oop, sorry. Too many things open. All right. Do we all see quote and a mushroom cloud? Cool. Thanks, Kathleen. Okay. All right. So I will start by reading the very first page of this book. It began with a bloom of fire on an off-white wall. The light swelled, blinding yellow darkening to a smoldering orange, all of it surging up from a nest of angry black smoke. There it burned, even the night singed red around the fireball, suspended, frozen in its incandescence within the dull rectangle of a plastic picture frame. At the center of the light, of the bright, billowing thing, was the darker shape of a man, arms loose at his sides, stance relaxed. He blocked the light, stood unchanged by it, only the shiny parts of him admitting to some anomaly in the landscape. A glow of firelight on his glasses, a gleam on his bald head. Bald like my uncle, like my father, like the men in my family. He was George, the grandfather I'd never met, the man who died of a heart attack a few years before I was born, in the room next to where I now lay under yellow flowered sheets, transfixed by his image. I could see the photograph by the amber light of the security beam over the driveway below, the night that burned all night long because out here in the country, night by itself was too dark. I stared and stared, a clenched thrill in my stomach. I felt myself floating, unmoored from time and space, drawn by my grandfather's eyes, eyes that knew everything yet said nothing, drawn to the desert where fire blossomed in silence, sprouting from a great featureless plain that could have been the end of the world, or the beginning. When I shut my eyes, the fireball lingered like the impression of a bright light just switched off, branded red behind my eyelids. So if you hadn't gathered from that, the photograph was of my grandfather posing in front of a nuclear fireball. And this was hanging above the bed that I slept when I visited my grandmother. Pretty striking and weird to be above a child's bed. And as you are when a child, you don't necessarily question these things or think about them. But when I was in college, when I was just about to graduate, I started to remember this photograph with this startling clarity. And I think I was at that age where you're trying to think about who you are in the world and how you want to be and what you want to be. And that process involved for me thinking about home and where I came from. And all of a sudden, this memory really struck me because it didn't align with who I understood myself to be and who I understood my family to be. I went to Quaker school growing up. Like, we were pacifists. We at home we had like our squirt guns couldn't look like guns. They were like the little frogs, or little dolphins, right? So we didn't even have toy weapons. And my mom had even been like an anti-nuclear activist in her 20s. She was in Chicago then. So you guys are based in Chicago. And I like organized this big series of event for WAND, Women's Action for Nuclear Disarmament then. And I believe had an event at Women and Children's First and got Helen Caldecott to come. And so, that was a big passion of hers. And so here was this image that hung in plain sight when I was a child. And we rarely discussed it. We rarely discussed my grandfather's work. And I didn't know what to make of this. How had the bomb become so domesticated and so unremarkable? And so I started to journal, and I started talking to family members and asking them about this history. And I started researching the historical context and trying to find out, like, what was this all about? And so this is what I learned. My grandparents in 1943 had moved to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was a city that was built in complete secrecy in 1943 for the sake of enriching uranium for the first atomic bomb. And it was a really strange place. At the height of production, there were about 75,000 people living and working there. And that's everyone from, janitors and secretaries and doctors and nurses and construction workers to scientists, school children. Basically, it was a totally self-contained town. And, you know, some 95 or 98% of people didn't know what they were working on, or were briefed to various levels according to like what they needed to know. They knew it was a war job, you know, that's it. They knew it was a top secret war job. And this policy was called compartmentalization. So it meant you knew only exactly what you needed to know to complete your job. My grandfather was a mid-level chemist, and he died before I was born. So, you know, part of this project was trying to understand who he was, and how he had come to be involved in this, you know, what I understand is an atrocious violence, and what it had, you know, how it had impacted him. As far as I can guess from, you know, my research, I think at that stage he might have known a little bit, like he might have been able to guess. Certainly he was a chemist and he was working with uranium, so he had a little bit more context than, say, a secretary or construction worker would have had. But he would not have been briefed on the whole project or really had an idea, you know, of, for example, the other labs working on it. Oak Ridge was, you know, Los Alamos is the city that people know a lot more about. That's where the sort of more famous scientists, the Oppenheimers, the you know, tellers, the other people that were kind of more making the decisions and knew what was going on. So Oak Ridge was more of an industrial site, but there were a lot more people there. And so, you know, it was a patriotic time and people were happy to have war jobs. The jobs paid well. And the wild thing is that people learned about what they were doing when Truman announced the bombing over the radio. So they learned along with the whole rest of the world. You know, it was really a wild thing. So I'm just going to read you a little scene that illustrates that. August 5 was a warm evening in Oak Ridge. Children pulled up chairs to dinner tables. Single women left dormitories for a cafeteria meal, hair coiffed and lipstick bright, and across the reservation, workers donned uniforms or stripped them off as they began and ended shifts or worked straight through the dinner hour, because this was a wartime schedule, and the whirring and the thumping and the buzzing of the machines never stopped. By the time the children were tucked into bed, what was done was done. Oak Ridge's purpose made manifest above a coastal city 7,000 miles away. The night was nearly moonless. Before lunchtime on August 6, 1945, President Truman's voice crackled over the radio announcing, 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. Before he named Oak Ridge, Truman spoke of massive production facilities where, quote, over 65,000 individuals are even now engaged in operating the plant. Few know what they have been producing, he said. They see great quantities of material going in, and they see nothing coming out of these plants, for the physical size of the explosive charge is exceedingly small. As he broadcast their task to the nation, those even now engaged did not hear him. It was the housewives, children home from school, nurses clustered around a radio, shift workers already finished or not yet begun their day's work who heard the news first. Hiroshima had been burning for 16 hours when the phones at the plant started ringing. It's happened, they said. We know what you've been building. Some scientists, alarmed by this breach of secrecy, not yet understanding, hung up on their wives. At first, people gathered in neighbors' homes and spoke in low voices. There was a buzzing excitement, but quiet, tentative. Was it now? Was this it? For all they had been instructed in secrecy, There had been no preparation for this moment. Then, it was as if the volume had been slowly turned up. People poured out of houses and plants. Within a few hours, the streets were full and loud with whistles, horns, laughter, and cheers. Scientists began to call out words that had been forbidden. Then others took up the cries without knowing what they meant. Fission, atomic, radiation, uranium. Oak Ridge went from being a city that whispered to a city that shouted. Doris, my grandmother, whose tiny frame now swelled in pregnancy, could not dance, but she could raise her arms above her head and clap, elbows flying, hallelujah. So I was chilled when I read about this scene of celebration, this celebration of atrocity, and by the broad national acceptance of nuclear weapons. You know, it's important to remember the context that it was this horrible war, and it was over. And I think it's also important to understand that there were a lot of press restrictions at the time that limited what people learned. So they weren't getting good information about what happened on the ground. So the press at the time was hardly covering the humanitarian toll. They were emphasizing industrial targets. And perhaps most importantly, they pushed this ahistorical narrative of a false choice between a bombing and a land invasion that had vastly inflated casualty numbers. So they said that at some like 1 million people or 500,000 people would have been killed in a land invasion, when the land invasion was actually planned for quite a bit later, and the casualty estimates were quite a bit lower. We can talk more about that later if people are curious, but that's the basic story. So I started to think a lot about secrecy, and that this became a theme. Oh, secrecy. Ooh, how do I go to the next slide? There we go. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show you this. This is a scene from the day they announced the surrender of Japan. So you can see people are all very excited about the war being over. This was in Oak Ridge. And then, so thinking about secrecy, this is a billboard that was from Oak Ridge during the war. So you can see there was everywhere, there was this push towards don't talk about what you're doing, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here. When you leave here, let it stay here. So this became a theme that I was thinking about is how does secrecy enable violence on the most intimate and global scales? So within families, within nations, within the world. So I already explained the policy of compartmentalization. And Leslie Groves, the Army Corps officer who oversaw the entire project, said later in his memoir, adherence to this rule not only provided an adequate measure of security, but it greatly improved overall efficiency by making our people stick to their knitting. I find that such a chilling quote, right? They didn't want people to look outside, to think about what the consequences of their actions might be, to be critical thinkers, to talk to each other. So during the war, compartmentalization disempowered workers. It separated them from a sense of responsibility. It numbed conscience. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, we see it dramatized when some scientists asked Oppenheimer to sign a petition against using the bomb on Japan. And he basically dismisses them, saying military decisions are not part of our job. So he wanted them to stick to their knitting. So this continues after the war. This policy becomes like further entrenched in the nuclear industry, and then it's internalized too in places like Oak Ridge. There's a sense that the culture has taken it up as well. So there's a self-enforcing quality. I think it's kind of relevant to think about that in this political moment about, I've been reading the phrase a lot, don't obey in advance. A lot of times in authoritarian regimes, you see people kind of start to self-police even before it's being enforced from the outside. So this is, people internalize these rules and start perpetuating these patterns in this culture of secrecy. So without secrecy, you don't have transparency or accountability. This was my grandfather. So he worked at the Y12 plant in Oak Ridge. It's still an operating plant, still does uranium operations, and he was there from 1943 through 1974 when he retired. So I was tracing secrecy on many levels, including personal levels, and including the cost of this work on my family. So George was a troubled figure. He was plagued by severe mental illness and alcoholism. And while it wasn't really a secret in my family exactly, it was something we sort of spoke about from a clinical distance. But I wondered, like, did this work and did this culture sort of, there were lots of reasons why he had mental illness, but did this also increase his unraveling? In 1974, he was medically retired from the plant, declared totally and permanently disabled. So my search on these questions about secrecy on the global scale, about secrecy on the personal level, was wide-ranging. These are some of the sources I consulted. I traveled to the Nevada test site where I toured it, where that photograph was presumably taken. I spent a lot of time in Oak Ridge interviewing workers and residents who were made sick by toxic contamination of the area. I spoke to activists, I spoke to government officials. I traveled to Japan, to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and interviewed atomic bomb survivors. I spent days in the archives of the Atomic Energy Commission that are housed outside of Atlanta. And I spent a decade researching and writing. So as you can see, I didn't stick narrowly to my family's story, and some people sort of wonder why. I probably could have written a book. There was like enough there. But I was sort of insistent about wanting to move beyond that, using the personal just as a starting point rather than an ending point. So I went some unexpected places, even outside of what would obviously be the nuclear realm. For example, I visited a cemetery for enslaved people from the pre-Secret City era. I explored the connection between colonial violence, racial violence, and nuclear testing. And I wrote about how compartmentalization also enabled violence within the Manhattan Project during the Cold War era and the nuclear weapons industry. So these are the houses that where Black workers during World War II were housed in Oak Ridge. So for the young white people who made up the majority of the population during the war, it was a pretty good place to be. The average age was 27. They were patriotic, they were eager to serve, they were, a lot of them were highly educated, they worked hard and played hard, there were bowling alleys and dances and movie theaters, people met their future spouses. I spoke to, women who found their way off the farm and married college-educated men. So it changed their lives, and at the same time, about 10% of the workforce were Black, and their living conditions were horrible. They were segregated, literally fenced off. It was the South, but actually this was, it was an area, not nearby Knoxville was much more integrated. It was a place where Black residents had positions of leadership in politics, in the fire department. So this was an anathema to the area, really. So they lived in these horrible houses called hutments that were not ventilated. They had very thin walls. They were plywood. They were built near the plants in areas that were not considered safe. They were segregated by gender. So even married couples couldn't live together. They couldn't bring their children. And there weren't any schools for the Black children either. So there were good schools for the white children there. They were good schools because they were all these like fancy scientists kids, but there were no schools for the Black children. And then you can imagine that they also worked the lowest paid and most dangerous jobs. And I learned to my horror how this, disregard for their lives led to some things that were really horrible. I mean, this was already horrible enough, but some really stomach turning events. So I'm going to read another section. Early on the morning of March 24th, 1945, a car of 6 Black workers bound for the K-25 plant pulled around a stalled government vehicle and crashed head-on into an oncoming dump truck in a chaos of screeching metal and the smell of burned rubber. The workers were taken to the Oak Ridge Hospital. One of them, Eb Cade, a middle-aged cement worker, had broken both legs and an arm. Of interest to the doctors was that he was, quote, a colored male, well-developed and well-nourished. He would be called HP-12. HP stood for human product. The doctors delayed setting his bones for nearly 3 weeks. Letters circulated between Los Alamos and Oak Ridge. Nurses collected Eb's urine, stored the samples. Detailed instructions arrived, along with a glass vial of plutonium. On April 10th, a doctor filled a syringe with the contents of the vial, pressed the needle into the skin of Eb's left arm, and plunged 4.7 micrograms of plutonium into his bloodstream, nearly 5 times what was then considered a safe dose. The following day, the 6th Armored Division of General Patton's Third Army marched into Buchenwald, one of the largest concentration camps within German borders. They were greeted by the cheers of some 21,000 emaciated prisoners. The brutal labor camp had imprisoned some 250,000 political dissenters, Jewish people, Roma, German deserters, and foreign prisoners of war, killing those too weak to work. Nazi scientists had also used prisoners to test vaccines for infectious diseases and treatments to, quote, cure homosexuality. The Manhattan Project was justified in the name of securing a more righteous world order. The experiment on Eb was justified in the name of developing safety standards for the nuclear workers who were, even then, being exposed to radiation and toxic hazards without full knowledge or adequate protection. Eb was told nothing. After being discharged, he returned to Greensboro to his wife. He was a beloved uncle who brought bags of oranges to his nieces and nephews on Sundays. He died 8 years later, at age 63, apparently of heart failure. Eb Cade was the first of 18 people to be injected with plutonium by the Manhattan Project doctors in the name of medical research, and one of thousands to be subjected to government-funded human radiation experiments without their consent during the Cold War. Almost without exception, writes Eileen Wellsome, an investigative journalist whose work was instrumental in uncovering these stories, the subjects were the poor, the powerless, and the sick. They were inmates in state prisons, developmentally disabled children, poor pregnant women and their unborn children, working class and Black patients checking into hospitals for cancer treatments. Decades later, it would be difficult to ascertain how many knew about the human experiments. Paper trails disappeared into thin air. Many denied knowledge and responsibility. Wellsome attributes the widespread justification of the experiments by doctors well aware of their ethical responsibilities to the culture of secrecy born of the Manhattan Project and solidified in the Cold War. Decade after Eb's injection, one Dr. Howland claimed he had performed the procedure against his own objections only when pushed by an order from his superior, Dr. Friedel. Dr. Friedel denied he'd ever given such an order and said that the injection had not been performed by Dr. Howland at all, but by one Dr. Dwight Clark. So, yeah, so that's, makes you catch your breath. makes your stomach hurt. And so to me, I really wanted to move beyond the memoir. To me, this wide-ranging research was an expression of an ethic of interconnectedness, a commitment to examining the web of visible and invisible relationships, to situating ourselves within a larger context. So we can draw a line from the devaluation of Indigenous and Black lives to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There would not have been an Oak Ridge without the displacement of Indigenous people or exploitation and enslavement of Black people. And when telling these stories, it's critical to bring up the stories that have been suppressed for telling the whole truth. So I contend that it matters that my grandfather worked and came of age as a man in a place where a Black man was injected with plutonium without his knowledge and consent. In a place where responsible doctors played hot potato with the blame. It matters to his story, even though he didn't know it, because he was part of a place that enabled this violence to happen. He was affected by it, and the place that enabled Hiroshima to happen. So these lives and deaths are all interconnected. And I see this kind of research and this kind of storytelling as in contrast to the policy of compartmentalization, to say these things are connected and we need to talk about them in the same breath. When we talk about Hiroshima, we should understand all the ways that the Manhattan Project caused harm. So I'll read another short section. In my family, only one anecdote has survived from the day Oak Ridge learned of the bombing of Hiroshima. Ma'am, my grandmother's boss purportedly told my pregnant grandmother after they'd heard the news, your baby will be born in peacetime. 9 days later, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, and the formal agreement that officially ended World War II was signed 2 weeks after that. My Aunt Karen was born in November. These were potent beginnings. In Mima's drawers upstairs at the lake house, I found a tiny black and white picture of her standing with a group of 11 older women, all white, holding their infants and toddlers. From her penciled note on the back, I gathered that this photograph was taken in February of 1946, when my Aunt Karen was 3 months old. These children are the pre-boomers, conceived before the assurance of peace, but born in the blissful months after the war ended. The woman's hair is curled and coiffed into soft and bouncy waves, and they wear straight-cut suit dresses and bold lipstick. Only about half look at the camera. The other half are engaged in trying to get their crying, squirming, or sleeping babies to look up. Psychology tells us that our earliest lives instill patterns, fears, and insecurities we may not even be able to remember or articulate. What did those babies wriggling in their mother's arms learn of silence before they could even speak? A father at a dinner table brooding on some accident at the plant, a spill maybe, a technical puzzle, or his own nagging suspicion that he knows what they are building. Or a nurse who's noticed something strange about the treatment of a Black cement worker, who knows 3 weeks is too long to leave bones unset, who feels in her gut what she will not speak even to herself. Or the wife cooped up at home with the baby, only rumors and her own imagination for company, because in this town, even gossip, even guesses are policed. And so there's just the click of silverware on ceramic, the smacking of lips, the rustle of napkins. So my struggle to uncover this hidden history became both the narrative momentum and the argument of the book. Writing about a man I never knew and a history that for the most part took place before I was born, a history that has been largely suppressed. I had to contend with unreliable memories, gaps, and doubt. For instance, the photograph that I mentioned at the beginning, when I would have described that photograph under oath. My memory was so certain. And yet when I went to look for it, I couldn't find it. and most of my family had no memory of it. So I started to question its existence. At the same time, maybe with higher stakes, writing about these stories that have been deliberately suppressed, I had to navigate redacted documents, strange bureaucratic language, yawning uncertainties. In response to a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request for any FBI files on my grandfather, I received the bewildering response that the documents I sought may have been destroyed on June 17th, oh, that's the wrong date. It was not June 17th, I don't know, 1996 or something. I called the FBI's FOIA office for an explanation, and this is what they said to me. The only thing we do is we type it in the computer, and the computer says that the records may have been responsive, were destroyed on that day. I asked what sort of records were destroyed that day. She told me they didn't know. All that it says is that records were destroyed on that date. I asked how they knew that the records I wanted might have been destroyed that day and not some other. She told me they had no way of knowing what records were destroyed because they were destroyed. So the secrecy leads to this sort of absurd and circular logic. And perhaps the biggest challenge in navigating these uncertainties and putting these tentative fragments together was in looking at the environmental contamination of the area. This was one of the hardest places to confront this uncertainty. So I spoke to sick workers and residents. I spoke to activists and scientists and representatives from the government agencies responsible for both the pollution and the cleanup. I poured over thousands of pages of environmental reports and public health studies. And there's some things that are clear. Oak Ridge is now a huge and very complex Superfund site. It was declared so in 1989 after information came out about tons and tons and tons of mercury that had leaked out, and with full knowledge of the Y12 plant in the 1950s and 60s. So that sort of started off this process that led to revelations of other sources of contamination. So that's very clear. It is a very polluted place, and it's one of the larger, more complex Superfund sites. But navigating the public health impacts is actually quite tricky. It's fraught with uncertainty. As some of you are probably familiar with, it's very hard to prove a link between exposure and health impacts, which doesn't mean they're not there. It just means that it's hard to prove. And it's, I learned that there's both a danger in understating harm and a danger in overstating it. From talking to lots of people, I started to understand that this is like a really, really complicated issue. And so I came to reflect on the ways that the secrecy then is like undermining that no matter what or how people's health is being affected, they're also having to grapple with uncertainty and fear. So it's these layers of what do you do when you can't trust the information that's being given to you? I spoke to a scientist who said one of the biggest dangers of this culture of secrecy was the way that it undermined democracy. So that's something that feels quite relevant today. So I'll read one more short section. At night, the shift between the city and outside is sudden and startling. One moment there are streetlights and strip malls, and then just past the west gates, the empty white guardhouses that once controlled access to the K-25 plant. The road is dark, long and lonely, lined on either side by a gray smudge of trees. As I left town one night, my headlights flashed against the reflectors on the roadside barrier and the tape in the lane divider, structuring my path with a bright rhythm through the otherwise unnerving stretch of nothing. I turned on the radio, flipped through the channels, top 40s, a local live broadcast, several country music stations. Then there was the musical drawl of a radio pastor, and I paused. Philosophy tells me I can tell you more and more about less and less, but I can't save you. I turned the radio off, and it was just the sound of my tires on the asphalt, the rush of air past my windows. Finally, there is no knowing, no certainty in a place with such widespread and complex contamination as Oak Ridge, in a place that has been steeped for years in an oppressive culture of secrecy. It comes down to a kind of faith in the bodies, in the numbers, in the institutions meant to protect us. I don't think the world can be reduced to numbers. In the cracks between the numbers are real lives, real bodies. There are the maybes and fears and what ifs. There are the hazards we did not consent to face. I believe this land, these people were hurt. I believe it matters that the fish and the spider still carried elevated concentrations of mercury that can be magnified through the food chain when eaten by birds and bats, that radioactive material still trickle into the streams and rivers that flow downstream. The Superfund mandated cleanup of Oak Ridge is due to be complete by 2047. What, I asked Dave Adler from the DOE, does it mean to be complete? That's a good question. He laughed and explained that it meant, quote, honoring all regulatory commitments to the state, to the EPA. But yes, he conceded, groundwater and waste burial grounds will require monitoring indefinitely. Toxic disasters, writes sociologist Kai Erickson, violate all the rules of plot. They never end. Invisible contaminants remain a part of the surroundings, absorbed into the grain of the landscape, the tissues of the body, and worst of all, the genetic material of the survivors. An all clear is never sounded. The book of accounts is never closed. So finally, I wrote this story as a kind of antidote against this culture of secrecy, a culture that plays into my family, the land, and as everyone here knows, ultimately the world. And I'll read one final little concluding section and then stop for questions. In one of the sociological studies I read about Oak Ridge, an activist recounted how a friend had ended a conversation on local contamination. She said in a shaky voice, I don't want to hear this. I don't need to know this. I am stuck here. This is where I have to live. This is the end of the conversation. I recognized my own impulse in the woman's panicked response. How many times have I wanted to stop asking questions, to take someone else's word for it? I do not want to have to live inside all of this knowledge with all of this scared uncertainty. I understand why Oak Ridgers, out of pride and self-protectiveness, talk around certain stories. We live in our minds more than our houses, and none of us want to be guilty or sick. Ghosts, as the lore goes, linger when unfinished business ties them to this earth. Guilt, betrayal, or great suffering condemns them to circle the sites of their most traumatic moments. But maybe the living too get stuck. We shut our minds on the truth we cannot bear to face, board up our hearts against suffering we cannot admit, both our own and that of others. A woman once told me that sore throats were symptoms of unexpressed desires. At the time, I thought it was a nice metaphor. Now I think it's literally true. The muscles of our jaws and throats straining against what we cannot let out. We fear that truth will force us to give up what is most precious. But why must love mean love without question? Why must loyalty require blind acceptance? I want love to mean that we fight for what is good and true and just with our eyes open. I want care to mean we take responsibility for ourselves, our choices, each other. I want home to be a place where no questions are unbroachable. And I will stop there and stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces. yeah, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your incredible story and sharing your personal information, both here and in the book. The timeliness of your remarks tonight are really incredible, given that this is the week when the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists reset the doomsday clock to 89 seconds before Armageddon, but also during a week when the administration has shut down websites and instructed agencies not to give interviews or share information with outsiders. It's incredible that here we are tonight discussing this very issue, and I want to thank you for being our presenter, our expert for the night. I have a lot of questions, and I hope I'll get mine in at the end, but we'll move on to the next part of our presentation, where you who have joined us tonight will have an opportunity to ask your questions, make statements, and get into dialogue with Emily. I will mention that our event is recorded, so if you don't want your picture or your identity being recorded, make sure you turn off your camera. You can even block out your name if you want, but we will be recording this and make the recording available after the event. And the same goes for the chat. We will make the chat available to the people who have participated in the event tonight. So you can look forward to that automatically after the presentation. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jan Boudart, who will manage the next section of tonight's event. Jan, take it away.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to thank Emily and all of you who came tonight for this very, I don't know the word, presentation that has been so important to us. So here's how the Q&A works. Each person gets one follow-up question after their question is answered. If you are making a comment or a long question or don't need feedback from the speaker, your comment may not be more than 3 minutes. And that includes your question. You may not take more than 3 minutes to ask your question. Please do not ask a series of questions one at a time. Raise your hand. Oh, 4 people already have done that. From the icon at the bottom, you raise your hand. We'll watch the screen to see if anybody raises their hand, and we'll try to pick you up if you did. Okay, in the chat, say stack. You know, go to the chat, say stack if you don't want to raise your hand, and we'll try to get you in order. You will get a second chance to speak if it is not before 1/2 and no one else has raised their hand. So I'm going to start this out by calling on Lynn Siegel. And Lynn, if you could ask your question as quickly as possible. Thank you.
So, Emily, considering this secrecy effect, what would be the harm in people just talking about the reasons that we did need to use an atomic bomb? And I'm totally opposed to any weapons, including guns, including knives, including anything. I'm Quaker, but still, wouldn't this be a better discussion of actually, you know, like, and how could that be brought up?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you rephrase it?
The fact that we made these bombs and we thought we were defending ourselves, like Israel thinks it's defending itself now, when it's not really, it's terrorism. You know, I get that. But how about an actual discussion, you know, in the community when all these people came out afterwards and talked about the fact that, yeah, they were doing something that they thought was good and it's not, and get more of an aura of curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were, you know, maybe more people than we hear about at the time who actually did push back. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was founded by scientists who were alarmed and, you know, didn't want the world to end of nuclear war. They were sort of going against the grain of the time. There were other scientists who led to, like, the Federation of American Scientists, that's still an important group today. There were scientists who were targeted later by the House Un-American Activities Committee because they were advocating for world governance to keep us from, to keep us from using nuclear weapons again. So, there were people at the time. John Hersey is, an important journalist who wrote Hiroshima. It was one of the first ways that the American public encountered some of the humanitarian effects. And that came out, I want to say 1947, but I could be wrong. It could be 1946. But anyways, it's an incredible and devastating book and work of journalism. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. And that really shook people up. It was a big deal. He kind of got in there with when other journalists weren't able to, and wrote a book that humanized the victims. So that said, yeah, there was a concerted. I guess maybe to your point too, I have sympathy for people who worked on the project who, some of them, there were Jewish scientists who were afraid that the Nazis were going to get the bomb first. There were, there were people who didn't even know what they were doing. It was a horrible war. So to your point, Lynn, yeah, it was, it was a complicated time. And there were scientists who, who signed petitions and tried to get them not to use the bomb on Japan. There were people who knew, who had been working on it. And once it was clear that Germany was going to surrender, they said, okay, we have to stop because Japan doesn't have the bomb. There was a British scientist named Joseph Rotblat who actually was the only one to resign. He said, I'm out, I'm out of this project. We're not the reason we started it is no longer valid. And so, yeah, so people, some people thought they were doing the right thing, and there were other people who could see outside of that narrative. And there was, a concerted government effort to control the narrative, to put out this story of this false choice between, 1 million casualties, and dropping the bomb, which, historians have basically debunked that. So thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. I'm going to call on Connie Klein next.
Thank you for a very powerful presentation and for writing your book. I'm just curious, is the course that you teach at Tufts primarily a writing course, or does it deal with this subject matter?
Yeah, thanks. So I primarily am a writing teacher. I teach creative nonfiction and journalism. I'm going to also be teaching some classes on environmental writing and writing about climate change. I do have some sort of regular classes that I have to fulfill with the curriculum and some leeway. So, at some point I could do a topics-based course that was more about nuclear issues.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what's going to happen with this administration, but I presume that if you could bring it up to modern day, RECA, for example, compensation,
Yeah.
the
And
victims.
totally. Yeah. And I do write about some of that too later on in the book. I just can't, get to everything, but I do mention RECA and some other things.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you.
powerful.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you again. And hi, Norma, you're next. Oh, can't hear you, Norma. You've got to unmute. Norma, unmute.
Jan, she's working on it. She's working
Oh.
on it.
Oh, how do you know?
Because she's talking to us through the screen.
Oh,
and
okay.
frantic about finding unmute.
No, for some
There's
reason,
it.
oh, here we go. Here's the button. I haven't done, sorry, everybody. Emily, thank you so much. It's so obviously deeply thought and felt material. And I have a question about, specifically about what you said, the danger in both understating and overstating harm. And I just want to quickly give you the context for which I'm saying that. I work on Fukushima, which means I also have to deal with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's just a chain of secrecy
often in which victims impose on each other to maintain the secrecy, both because of quick example would be how many Hiroshima and Nagasaki victims wouldn't apply for health booklets until their children were safely employed and married because they didn't want it to come out that they had children with probably contaminated, damaged genes. And that kind of mutual, the secrecy imposed by sufferers on each other. In Fukushima, the big threat would be now you're standing in the way of reconstruction. And we're coming up on the 14th anniversary, and already there are children growing up for whom it's history and who are not taught in schools what things they should be careful of since they live on contaminated land. And so there's so many ways in which I can imagine applying your statement about the harms and understating and overstating harm, the danger. And so I wondered if you could give some specific examples. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah. It was something that was a surprise for me to learn. And thank you, for the important work you're doing, Norma. I think I went in sort of like guns blazing, being like, a wrong was done here. People were sick. Like, I gotta find out about it. And like, it's true. That's, part of the story. But, I really tried to talk to a lot of people and get as educated as I could. And so, one important example I was trying to write about, Scarborough is the historically Black community that's closest to Oak Ridge. And I mean, to Y-12, the nuclear plant where my grandfather worked. And so it was sort of like the common story was that it was the most contaminated, which makes sense. Like there's a lot of environmental justice. That's not a surprising story. And I was hard to find someone to talk to from Scarborough. People, it's in the past, they have other problems. And I mean, it's not, contamination is not in the past, right? But it feels historical. People are dealing with other issues. I made a lot of cold calls. I sent a lot of emails to no response. I finally found this guy who had been, he had actually worked at Y-12 as a chemist. He was, a scientist, very knowledgeable, but lived in Scarborough. Was one of the early Black scientists at Y-12. And, he shared with me this series of articles that he'd written for the Oak Ridger, and that he and a group of residents had written, and like that had all this data and all these studies about how actually, there was ways that the story about Scarborough was being misrepresented. So people would say that the creek, the East Fork Poplar Creek that goes directly from Y-12 into Oak Ridge and is like one of the most contaminated creeks with mercury, said that it went right straight through Scarborough. And he pointed out, actually, if you look at the map, it actually only skirts the edge, but it goes straight through downtown Oak Ridge, or like the geography, there is actually a ridge between Y-12 and Scarborough. So yes, it was contaminated. There was, it's not that there wasn't contamination there, but actually the way the airflow goes, it wouldn't have necessarily been the most polluted area, and the data backs that up. And so you get a community that's already economically depressed, and then make people afraid for their health, which they should, they should ask for cleanup. They should ask for the studies, right? I'm not saying any of that isn't true. And then also it hurts their property values, right? So it's just like the accuracy really matters. The accuracy matters because we have to deal with our fears, and the consequences. Yeah, I mean, we get it with vaccine stuff too, right? Vaccines have side effects, but that doesn't mean that they're, like that they're not effective in what they're trying to do. And so we just need as much accurate information as possible.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for that question.
Thank you. Our next questioner is Carolyn Kroom. Go ahead with your question, Carolyn.
Hi, thank you for talking. Really appreciate hearing about your book. And I just recently got involved with nuclear weapons issues, really just the past few months. And I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm part of a group that is going to present to our city council a resolution on nuclear disarmament based on the Back from the Brink organization. They have a 5 points on nuclear disarmament that many communities have signed on to, and organizations and stuff. And because I'm so new to all of this, I was just wondering if you, since you have done a lot of research and traveling, what kinds of things, and it could be like what Back from the Brink is doing, or something else, have you seen people do to help further nuclear disarmament and that particular part of this whole issue? Um, because again, I just haven't been involved long enough to even. I've heard from Back from the. I mean, I know about that, but that's it.
Yeah. Thanks
Um,
for that. And thanks for your work on that. It's really important. So the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons is a really big player in this space. They are an international group, as you might imagine from the name, that actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. The prize was accepted by Setsuko Thurlow, who is a Hibakusha atomic bomb survivor, on behalf of the organization. And they basically have passed a treaty in the UN that makes nuclear weapons illegal. Now, of course, it's only binding on the nations who sign it, but about half the countries in the world have signed it. And their goal is to make nuclear weapons so taboo that they eventually pressure the nuclear powers to sign it. Now, you can imagine none of the nuclear powers have, and they don't support it. But they are building a global movement. One of the other things that's important about the way that they're thinking of it is they're really thinking holistically about the ways that nuclear armed nations also need to provide reparations and support for cleanup for those who have been affected by weapons testing and other issues, and like understanding the unequal impacts of nuclear weapons. So I think that's one of the first places I would look.
Thank you. I had heard of ICANN, but I haven't actually gone to their website.
Okay. Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah. Thanks.
I'm going to call on Mark Lundholm because he put a question in the chat. Mark, can you unmute, or are you still with us? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. I worked in the environmental industry and worked on Superfund sites and things like that. We only had one in West Chicago that, to my knowledge, had some nuclear stuff. They were reprocessing what they called rare earth minerals back in the 50s, and I think that stuff was shipped in there. I believe that site's closed. They're still monitoring groundwater, but I've been curious about different Superfund sites. I worked on there was a Sherwin-Williams paint compounding plant in Coffeyville, Kansas, that had a big barium pile that was covered up. And when you go out and do this kind of work, you might get exposed to stuff, but my company was pretty good at giving you proper PPE. But you think about nuclear energy stuff and nuclear, is there any PPE that really protects you from doing that kind of work? That was my question.
Yeah. That's not a question I know the answer to in detail. I guess my non-answer would be is that I think that some people who work in that field like really do it for the right reasons, and want to clean up the environment, and want to protect workers. And there's money in it, and there's people who are trying to cut corners. And people aren't necessarily fully informed always. What it makes me think of actually is another thing that I read about in my book, which is the Kingston fossil plant. So not a nuclear plant, it's a coal burning plant. In 2009 had an incredible accident where they spilled lots and lots of toxic coal fly ash, onto the lake where outside of Oak Ridge. And that plant ironically was built to power Oak Ridge during the Cold War. And the cleanup there was marked by like horrendous abuses of workers denied PPE when they had coughs. They were told it was allergies. They were laughed at. Like air monitors were, the data was falsified. There's been a lot of lawsuits. Dozens of workers have died. Hundreds are sick. So it's a very blatant case of like of workers being taken advantage of. So yeah, that's one to look into, but not a nuclear one. Thanks.
Kind of a sad story.
Yeah, it's very sad.
Okay, I'm going to call on the director of NEIS, David Kraft. So David, what's
Thank
up?
you. Thanks. I was struck by a comment, a question you actually raised when you gave your presentation. How does secrecy enable violence? And as you were continuing to relate your story, it was clicking with me more and more that it was a story of the complicity and the banality of evil, and how this was kind of a real life Petri dish precursor for the Stanley Milgram experiments that took place, I guess, in the 60s. So my question to you is, either have you or are you aware of other colleagues who look into the crossover between, the psychiatric components of this and then just like the real life, well, it's a horror really of what is going on in these situations where people just kind of go along, supervisors tell them, don't ask, that sort of thing. Stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. No, I mean, I think I'm glad that that question resonated beyond the specifics to you of that history, because to me it is, it's not just, this doesn't just happen in the nuclear industry, right? It's kind of hard, even like within capitalism that we're living. None of us are like living a purely kind of, I don't know. I don't think anyone's off the grid right now, right? Because we're all zooming in here tonight. And so like how we navigate, like knowing the way that our lifestyles like cause harm, and try to do the best we can and stay alive to like and awake to suffering in the world and try to make intentional choices. Like I think sometimes it's easier to just shut it off, and because you all are here, you're people who care and like think about these questions, I know. And so that's really great. And not everyone does. And I think it's going to get scarier the next, I mean, right now, workers are being like told to snitch on their colleagues if they're doing DEI work. And so there's going to be more of this, like, keep your head down, siloed. So yeah, I think it shows up everywhere. We're all kind of in danger of compartmentalization, of just keeping our heads down and not sticking to our knitting, right? And when is like the moment to not stick to your knitting? And I, think about this like kind of on a daily basis, like when is my moment to say something that maybe someone doesn't want me to say, or bring a conversation into a space that's maybe they don't expect that conversation. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what it brings up for me.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Roger Johnson, will you please ask your question?
Thank you, Emily. A small preface, we have something in common. A half a century ago, I lived in Boston, taught at Tufts University, and my wife graduated from Tufts. But let me go back to the myth that the atomic bomb was used to end the war, and that's total nonsense. That never happened. And I hope you can comment on that. We know that in July of 1945, the Japanese had already agreed to surrender, and they were just haggling about the role of the emperor. And we knew that they saved up bombing Hiroshima in order to destroy it totally. And they were terrified that the war would end before they could use it. They wanted to see what happened on a human population. And this was the nuclear industry and the government. And the president told them there would be all hell to pay if they didn't use that bomb before the war ended. And Nagasaki raid was totally botched to begin with. And so and Rothblatt, yeah, he resigned, refused to participate when he heard they were only going to use it on Japan. But the nuclear industry continued after the war, the same thing. And that's the human radiation experiments went on for 20 or 30 years. And there's thousands of experiments where they killed people and they injected them with plutonium. And like you said, I know you are aware of all this. I didn't see you emphasize it as much, but I mean, would you agree that the atomic bomb, they knew it was totally unnecessary and the war was already over?
Yeah, I do agree. And I write about that, in more detail in my book. I didn't hammer it home because I sort of thought maybe this group would be somewhat knowledgeable with that history. But but I think it's important, and I'm sort of shocked sometimes by how many people still have inherited that story.
Japan surrendered.
Yeah, and so the whole story of this land invasion versus bombing was basically like crafted and put out by Harry Stimson, the Secretary of War, in an article in Harper's. He like wrote this article because people were like the government was getting uncomfortable because people were uneasy with the bombing. And so they put this narrative out there and really pushed this certain story. So thank you for bringing that up, Roger.
Thank you. Jackie Dressler has had her hand up and down and up and down. I wonder if she's here and wants to ask a question. Jackie, are you here?
Yes, I am here, and hi, Emily, and thank you all for this amazing unfolding of your story that is far-reaching. And I mean, you've touched on so many elements, the mental health aspects, the secrecy, the horrible harms to Indigenous and Black folk of the time, the way they were treated. It's just actually, I can't say I can't wait to read your book, because I think it's going to be so devastating that I mean, I might not be able to. But I, in this time that we're in right now, of course, with this new administration, I think having these stories out there and having a community that can talk about this and tell other people about it. And I have to tell you, I was very concerned about Rekha because I have my own story, not my own personal family story, but a family that I was very close to that was terribly harmed. And I actually used that story with my congressman to sway him to try to bring back the Rekha bill. So I think, bringing the stories out is incredibly important. And I'm sure that your book is going to be phenomenal. So thank you very much.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment, Jackie. And let's see. I'm sorry for hesitating. I'm going to call on Jake next because his hand has been up for quite a long time. He's on the phone. It is you, isn't it, Jake?
Hi.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for this excellent presentation. Please tell us your name again and your grandfather's name and the connection there. Also, please give us contact information, because I'm involved with another group called Chicago Area Peace Action, and this is one of their issues, and I think they'd be interested in hearing your story. Also,
well, listen,
just
Jake, let me tell you,
what?
I can give you her name and all this. Jake has got some vision problems, so you want her name and her contacts, right?
Right.
Okay.
Now, just a comment, and that is, with all the secrecy, the information, they were secret. They were under tight secrecy because they didn't want the information to leak out to Stalin. But the information leaked out anyway. There was a German physicist by the name of Klaus Fuchs who was allowed in. He was a known communist, but he was allowed into the Manhattan Project apparently because he just knew the stuff better than anyone else, and he knew it in a practical way, not just theoretical like Einstein, but he knew it in a practical way as to how to make things happen. So they allowed him into the Manhattan Project. It turns out that he's probably the one who transferred the information to the Soviets.
Mhm.
That's the whole irony of the secrecy. Get my
Yeah.
drift?
Yeah, no, I get it. And I think even if you argue that there's a legitimate national security interest in nuclear weapon secrecy, which I think we should just get rid of nuclear weapons, which would make that a moot point. But even if you argue that, it's still true that secrecy has been used as an excuse to keep other things secret, like environmental contamination. So
Sure.
yeah.
Linked it to what?
It has been used as an excuse to keep other things secret, like the environmental contamination.
Right, he was saying
Sure.
he leaked it to, I couldn't hear the word he said when they leaked.
Oh,
Oh, what happened, they were under tight secrecy to try to prevent the information to be leaked out to the Soviets. The Soviets got the
right.
information anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So they blamed it on the Rosenbergs. But it turns out there's a German scientist by the name of Klaus Fuchs, who was a known communist. They allowed him into the Manhattan Project because he was a physicist and he just knew the stuff better than anybody else. And more likely than not, he was the one who leaked the information to the Soviets.
Okay, Jake, your history is very interesting. You remember a lot. Okay, let's call on Sadie.
Hello. Thank you, Emily. But I have two questions. First, I researched your book and it said it was written in 2023. Is there anything you learned over like the year, 2 year period that you would like to have like added to the book or changed in the book? Something like that.
That's a great question. It's so hard. One of the hard things about writing a book is you commit to sort of an end point when, history keeps going. There's, I wish I could have ended with like, and we abolished nuclear weapons, but instead the end of the book is a little bit ominous, One of the things that I wondered it was going to happen, I was like, if I publish this book, then someone's going to find the photograph that I like spend the book chasing down and write to me. No one has yet found the photograph. Some long lost family have contacted me. And if I had known them, I would have interviewed them. Also, maybe one of the coolest contacts that I got, maybe 6 months ago or something, someone who'd actually been a state inspector on the mercury leaks found the book and read it and wrote to me. And I was really relieved that he said I got it right because, I did my due diligence. I talked to as many people as I could and checked my facts, but with complex things, when suppressed histories and science, people make mistakes. So, but if I had known him before, I would have interviewed him for the book for sure. Yeah.
And then also in like the fight for like nuclear disarmament across the world, do you think in our world today there is a future where with this like culture of secrecy that's been passed on from the 40s, 50s, 60s and on with like the deleting of records and not teaching children that live in these harmful areas about it, do you think there's a world where we are able to get our governments to give up these nuclear weapons and not just have more secret like nuclear weapons, to have that bargaining chip and have that power over other countries still?
That's a super good question. I wish I knew the answer. I guess I will say I definitely have a pessimistic bone in my body. It feels like there's not the political will and people in power do not want to give up nuclear weapons. And when I hear stories like Setsuko Thurlow, who, was an atomic bomb survivor who has spent her life about like fighting for the abolition of nuclear weapons and other hibakusha who have devoted their lives to telling the story of their most traumatic days over and over and over again for the sake of abolishing nuclear weapons, I think, well, I can't give up hope. They're the ones who like it really affects. So yeah, we need like a really radical cultural and political shift. In the meantime, I think it's important to like remember that there are the safeguards also matter. You know, if we're going to have nuclear weapons, well, there need to be levels of, like, right now, the president has too much power over like when to launch them, right? So like, even if I don't agree with people necessarily who are like doing arms control as opposed to disarmament, as opposed to abolition, which are sort of three different levels, I still want the arms control people doing their work. You know, I still want the people who are working on treaties to do their work to like have treaties so that we don't use nuclear weapons. Like those safeguards are important, and our institutions are important until we can get to that nuclear free world. Jen, you're muted.
I want to mention one thing. It's now 21 minutes after 8, and this program is supposed to continue to 8:30. Often our speaker doesn't mind going on beyond that, but it's up to Emily, because if she wants to end at 8:30, we end at 8:30. So
yeah, I can go on. I can go on longer. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, so I'm going to call on Kathy Barnes. She put her question in the chat, but now she can ask it in person. Kathy, unmute, please.
Hello. Yeah, I want to tell you thank you. It's a wonderful thing that you wrote. It's a great book. You're a good writer. I was wondering, have you been able to engage young people in the anti-nuclear movement? A lot of us are older, and for me, it's very hard to get anybody interested. Nobody wants to, get involved with it. And your book is very moving. I'm an artist, and I've done some anti-nuclear art, but people, they want to just see pretty pictures and all this. I think that if there's a way that artists and writers could motivate and get younger people, involved. What do you think about that? Do you have any ideas about how to do that? And have you been able to do that? Sort of to debunk the myth of nuclear as being green energy. Get people involved.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's tricky. People feel like it's a problem of the past. They didn't grow up with duck and cover drills and that kind of thing. I wouldn't say that personally I've been successful getting young people involved, but I've met some like young people. So a group that I talked to with the book, and a group I'm very grateful for, is the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. They're, the only group in Oak Ridge's area that is being any kind of a watchdog. And you wouldn't really know it from their website, but they're actually doing a lot, and they have a lot of institutional knowledge, and they know everything about Y12. And I did a reading in Knoxville, and some of them came out, including a young woman who was a college student at UT. And she was has been very involved both academically and in her activist life with nuclear issues. And it was similarly struggling. We had a conversation later about trying to get her peers involved. But they also now have a new director or coordinator of that group who is a younger woman. I also have connected with through the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, met a couple young women who are part of this fellows program. So they're working on nuclear security issues, and they basically serve for a year where they get to be part of the Science and Security Board's deliberations about the doomsday clock, and kind of learn from all this expert knowledge. And so was sort of heartened to see these young women seeing this as a really important issue to get engaged in.
Speaking of young people, our speaker tonight is very young. Emily is less than 35, I think. Not that you have to answer that question.
I'm 37, actually.
Oh, okay.
People, yeah, I look younger than I am, but thank you.
But you're young by comparison to most of us here. David, ask your question, please.
Okay, thanks. There was a second phrase that you mentioned that really caught my ear during your presentation. the idea of colonial and racial violence being tied into nuclear testing. So I have not read your book, so I don't know if you address this, or if you haven't, are you aware of those who have? The same situation, the colonial situation with the French in Algeria and Micronesia, the British in Australia, and what they did with the Aborigines, even the Russians in the various stands, just disregarding the local populace and essentially using them as guinea pigs. So I don't know, as I say, if you addressed it in your
Yeah.
book. If not, are you aware of others who have?
So I address it in passing. It's not been the focus. But I do talk about nuclear testing. I talk a little bit more about the effect on Indigenous folks in the US, and name it as part of a larger pattern. So certainly I'm aware of it. I also write a little bit about the uranium mining that happened in the Congo, that the uranium, that most of it that went into the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was mined in the Congo under like pretty horrendous conditions. So I read about that, and did gather information from various sources. I'm not off the top of my head, not sure the best place to direct you, but there are people who've done important work on like nuclear colonialism and nuclear imperialism. And it's, I guess, maybe one interesting source that I look to is African Americans in the Bomb by Vincent and Tondi, which is not directly about that, but it's about sort of like in the 60s civil rights era, the African American activists and leaders who made the connection between civil rights and nuclear issues, and sort of understood their struggle as connected to a global struggle. And part of that was making these links between the way that the bomb has been deployed in racist ways in other communities, and like understanding that there's sort of a shared global fate there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So now I'm going to call on myself, and because I don't really have a question, but I wanted to mention the fact that when the International Uranium Film Festival was in Chicago this summer, the winner of the prize was a film called Jadu Goda, which is about a village in India where the young woman was scheduled to get married that day. And her fiance realized that she was in a village where there was a lot of uranium being mined, and she was unable, and her father was very upset because he really wanted to marry his daughter, and it was beginning to be impossible because of the stigma of being around uranium. And then there's another book called The Postman of Nagasaki, where at the end of the book, after the bomb is dropped on Nagasaki, there were people in Japan in the military who really wanted Japan, the Japanese people, to completely sacrifice themselves and to continue fighting and until they were really obliterated. And I think that ties to something that David Kraft is very has written about, and that is the addiction of people to violence, war, and now the addiction of people to nuclear. And then I wanted to mention one other book, One Sunny Day, about a cohort of Setsuko Thurlow, who wrote a book about her experience. And these books, along with Emily's book, are so helpful. The Postman of Nagasaki was just really interesting, and so was One Sunny Day. And the fact that the prize winner was a young woman in India who was stigmatized on account of uranium. And so now, because Steve Sondheim hasn't had a chance to talk yet, I'm calling on Steve.
Sorry, really quick
sorry.
before you do,
apologize.
yeah, no, that just reminded me when you said Suko Thurlow, I forgot who asked the question about young people, but I thought of something else that I wanted to share, which is there's a woman, a filmmaker named Michi Takeuchi, who is the granddaughter of granddaughter and daughter of atomic bomb survivors. She's a filmmaker who lives in New York now. And her grandfather was actually the head of the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital during the bombing. So you can imagine, like, he saw some stuff.
Yeah.
But she made a film called A Vow for Hiroshima that it's about the life of Setsuko Thurlow mostly, and a little bit about her life.
Oh, yeah, I read that.
But she might be an interesting person to invite. But we've been talking for a couple of years and have kind of become friends and may collaborate on something at some point. But she is also really interested in this question of engaging young people too.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Stephen, you are unmuted and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, before I ask that question, Emily, you mentioned a group out of Oak Ridge, a young group that's an advocate for. Can you mention that again, or have?
Yeah, they're not necessarily young, but their coordinator is younger. It's the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. And I know they have done some work with, I can put their acronym in the chat. They have done some work with college campus, with students on college campuses, and tried to do some advocacy at UT.
Okay, thank you. That'll be in the chat. My question is parallels to today. Particularly and I'm not sure how much of what was going on then in the secrecy was defensiveness and power to win the war, but I think a good deal of it is, and today it's financial. And there's a lot of, besides secrecy, there's a lot of lying and covering and convincing, and the public is duped. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on the financial aspects and also on the parallels you see to today, because this movement for more and more nuclear power, it's out of hand, and we're losing. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, yes, the military industrial complex and other corporations are powerful. A lot of it is about I focus more on the weapons side, so I'm know some about nuclear energy, but certainly, defense contractors, like, it's big money. It's really big money. And so, yeah, a lot of these decisions are driven on a political level. For instance, in Oak Ridge, they're building a massive uranium processing facility that even if you argue that we should be maintaining our current weapon supply, which is clear, probably I don't believe that. But even if you make that argument, the scale in which they are proposing to produce is well beyond what we would need to maintain our current weapon stockpile. And that's for money reasons. That's not like military strategy. We don't need that many weapons for deterrence if you believe that deterrence works. So yeah.
Right,
certainly.
but I asked this question partly in relation to nuclear power, in that it's just on a roll, on a total roll.
Yeah.
The parallels to hiding consequences from the public or duping the public. That's what okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that hasn't been my main focus, but I think certainly the way that nuclear energy has grown up in concert with nuclear weapons, like, their history has always been tied. They do share a lot of problems of this secrecy and suppression.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Alfred Meyer, don't disappear. I thought we were going to have you ask a question or make a comment. Oh, yeah, there you are. Alfred, could you, yeah.
Yes, I was just wanted to say that I think that we have fallen into the trap of believing that we can dominate through violent force. And it was one of the lessons we did not learn in Vietnam, where we dropped in that tiny little country more bombs than were dropped in all of World War II. And I ask, how did we do? We didn't win. We're seeing the same thing in Gaza now. You can level the place and the spirit still maintains. But I worry about the fact that we started this race and we're in a position now where our facilities and our staff people are older and aging out and decrepit. And meanwhile, China and Russia have newer, younger, more modern stuff. So we're in this huge push to try to catch up. And that's why there's the whole huge push on nuclear power, which I see as totally a cover story for getting public support for nuclear weapons, and in particular for engaging young, smart science students to go into nuclear science, because we don't have the people to make more new bombs. And so, yeah, we don't need 80 new pits. None of it makes any sense from a rational standpoint. But if we're trying to dominate through our nuclear capacity, this is what we're doing. And I also worry about, and I'm trying to find more information, is that it's a huge part of our national economy. And, in 1954, National Geographic said that the nuclear industry was the biggest source of investment in the country in 1954. And I think we're still caught in that ex-Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz has written a report in which he says civilian nuclear power is an essential enabler. Think of those two words, essential enabler of national security. And he points out that the supply chain for the nuclear navy is in a mere 44 out of the 50 states. So Congress, I was in a congressional office meeting once, and the staffer, we asked him what he thought of subsidies for nuclear power. And the guy went euphoric. He said, this is the topic that has the most bipartisan support on the Capitol Hill. This was a few years ago. But I think that everybody's on the gravy train. Here in New York, where I live, the governor's chasing huge piles of money, free government money to go nuclear. So that's what we're up against.
Yeah. And so let's cut Head Start and fund nuclear instead, right? That's what they're
right.
Well, climate
I'll
research, talk about government inefficiencies. Yeah.
Yeah. One of my big concerns is the push for renewed testing. And
Oh, yeah.
I'm suggesting to my colleagues that we really focus on heading that off at the pass, because I think that people will not accept it. But if we wait until the announcement comes out that says, well, we're planning one, we've missed the boat.
Yeah.
So we have to get in gear now.
Yep. Yep.
Alfred has spent many years drawing the connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, as has NEIS. We've all. Okay, it looks like Pat Bulla is going to be next to ask a question. Pat, go ahead.
You hear me?
Yeah, you're fine.
I'm astounded that some of my good friends who are very concerned about climate change, their comment is, we have to have nuclear in order to deal with climate change. And I just wonder how you deal with that.
Well, again, nuclear isn't the energy hasn't been like my total area of focus. So this isn't a conversation that's always coming up for me. But I do point out the problematic links between nuclear energy and weapons. And of course, you all know how many problems there are with nuclear energy. It's, it's too expensive, it's too resource intensive to build, the waste, we don't know what to do with it, the health consequences, and on and on. I think we have a lot of better solutions. One of which needs to be, we need to use less energy also.
And building nukes takes too long.
Oh, yeah.
By the
Yeah.
time we get it built, the climate is going to have run away.
Right, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. It's they take too long to get online, even if they were a good option.
And Pat, I'm gonna put in the chat. NEIS, we've produced an animated video that talks about why climate or why nuclear is not a good climate change solution, and that'd be something that you can share with your friends. So I'll be putting that in the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's great.
Yeah, that's a really excellent video.
Mm.
What's the name of it? You Can't Nuke Climate Change, is that? Okay, so now we're back to the people who have already asked questions, and it's 20 minutes to, what is it, 8 o'clock where you are? 20 minutes to 10, or wherever, it's 20 minutes to the hour, wherever we are.
Mhm.
So I'm going to ask people to keep their questions short and give Emily a break. So we'll go back to Lynn Siegel. Go ahead and ask your question, Lynn.
Lynn, you're muted.
Why is it a secret?
Why is it a secret? I'm sorry, I have a tickle in my throat. I'm afraid I'm going to drink some water.
I
think
don't believe in secrets, any secrets, ever, under any conditions.
Okay.
Medical, anything. It's all, life short.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think in this case, secrecy serves power, right? It serves money. Excuse me. It keeps people quiet. It keeps people from knowing the consequences of their actions to themselves and to others. It keeps them from speaking up. Yeah, it serves the status quo.
The average person sees hundreds of online.
Nope.
What was that?
To me, a secret just means there's something wrong going on. Automatically.
Yeah.
If it's
Well,
secret,
thank you, Lynn. Thanks very much, Lynn. And we're going to go now to Jake. He has another question. Go ahead, Jake. Unmute. Oh, good.
Okay, can you hear me? This is just a quick question. Have you considered taking your book and making a movie out of it, either for commercial purposes or to play it, say, on public television?
I did have a conversation with a screenwriter who is interested in adapting it. That didn't go anywhere, which I think is okay. I don't think we were quite seeing eye to eye. I don't know. I guess I'd be open to it. I'm not a filmmaker, so I'd
Okay,
need some
well, talk to someone at PBS Channel 11 in Chicago, or one of the PBS stations, and see if they'd do it as a documentary to show on public television.
Okay.
Because I think they'd probably be more open to it.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, Carolyn Kroom, you ask your question now, please.
Yes, Emily, you were mentioning young people, and you mentioned a young woman from UT. Were you saying the University of Texas at Austin?
Oh, sorry, University of Tennessee.
Oh, University. All right. Okay. I was going to say if you know if she was from Austin, I would like to connect, but okay,
Yeah.
forget about it.
I know of some people in New Mexico, but unfortunately, I don't have contacts in Austin.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Jackie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So I just wanted to mention 3 things. I was on a Zoom the other night on a webinar called Resisting Nuclear Annihilation, Dangers and Actions. It was amazing. And what was the most amazing was a young man, I'm not going to get his last name right, named Rishi Guru Divan. He's still in high school, and he is starting a nationwide group, Students for, the number 4, Disarmament. And that's just Students for Disarmament at Gmail. And this is across high schools and across states and at college campuses to raise awareness of the need for disarmament. So he was an astonishing young man that he may be worth reaching out to with your book. That would be a very interesting thing to get going there.
Sorry,
we-
can you tell me the name
Yes,
again?
it's RISHIGURUDEVAN, and his organization is called Students for Disarmament. You can reach him at that at Gmail.
Okay.
Okay. And then the other thing is, someone mentioned, that they had a friend who believes the nuclear needs to be here until we can, find the other ways. And so, one of the biggest proponents for getting off gas was Bill McKibben. And he kind of changed to the idea of, well, we need the nuclear that's existing until things can change, or we need the nuclear, which has really upset many, many people. But I was on a webinar last night on the Project Maple Pipeline, and he was one of the guest speakers along with Sandra Steingraber. And I put a question in. My question was, first it was coal to gas, which has become the bridge. Now it's renewables, and renewables are on the back shelf. Big money is now going to nuclear as the new bridge fuel in New York State, and we must stop this. Can Mr. McKibben speak to this, especially as Mark Jacobson, who he mentioned as his friend, feels that nuclear power is not a climate solution? Well, we have changed a mind. Actually, the Chinese students who've invented AI without these big chips that cost $30,000, Mr. McKibben said, in the end, nuclear is not going to amount to much. It's incredibly expensive. Solar and wind are pennies. It is unbelievably time consuming. The data center example of why building more gas and nuclear just got kicked in the rear end by 20 Chinese students. So there's hope. There's hope that we can change minds, and especially
Thank
with
you
the
for
young
that.
people. So you try to reach out to that young fellow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. That's great.
Zadie, you have another question?
Yes, this is a bit more of a comment, but I still do have a question. So just learning about like all the secrecy that was created in the US, and it's great that we live in a country where you're able to find these records and trace things back, even if some things are deleted, but we're able to like have 40 people and get together and criticize these government projects. But I would also like wonder how different nuclear powers like China, Russia, North Korea would be handling this, especially with the secrecy that's already built into their like authoritarian governments, and how like the people that are affected by these dangerous nuclear environments would also be undereducated. So I think that definitely in the US it's something we need to think about, but also just worldwide, how much like how there might be still human testing today in these oppressive governments. But I was just wondering if you touched on that in your book, or maybe you found something about that. But I feel like those would definitely be places where we should be concerned about that.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. Yeah, that we at this point are still able to criticize. We have public records laws in this country, which like it's not perfect and you can't get everything and some of it's redacted, but like, I still got stuff. I still got environmental reports that were like publicly available on a website. The reason that I could get records about my grandfather's work is because of nuclear workers who were sick, who advocated for the passage of the EEOICPA, Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Act, which is a mouthful. But part of they advocated for compensation for their nuclear illnesses, and so now there's a process for getting that compensation, which involves you need your records, your work records. And so that meant that someone like me who was looking at it for a different purpose could access those records. So it is like, thanks to, to the point of like hope, like some things have changed around secrecy because of activists like fighting for transparency. And yeah, so we have processes, and yes, we should be concerned about those places that don't have that kind of process, and concerned for ourselves with, as people have pointed out, I think especially David said, like we're seeing clampdowns on the communication of our public agencies, like even this week. So I have friends who work at the CDC who aren't allowed to talk to the public as of a week ago. So
Okay, I just have one thing that feels unfinished, and that is Diane DeRigo at one point wanted to ask a question or make a comment, and she never got a chance to. And I wonder if she's still here. And yeah, Diane, please tell us what you had in mind.
Well, two things actually. One is I'm working with actually retired TDEC, Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation people. I spent the first 20 years working here fighting TDEC, and I still would fight TDEC, but these are retirees who got in touch with me and 2 or 3 retired EPA people who are very worried about the new landfill that's dug at Oak Ridge. Are you familiar with that? MD or EMF. They've got acronyms.
They all have so many acronyms, yeah.
The old one is leaking and horrible, and now this new one is designed so that it will actually, you hear a risk of 1 in a million or 1 in 10,000, 10 to the -6 to 10 to the -1. This is 10 to the 0. Every person who fishes and swims in the streams downstream will get cancer, according to the allowable permit. So anyway, we've got a lawsuit going against them, and I wanted to maybe be in touch with you on that, because you might have other ideas of people who might also want to join in that. And then the other thing I have to share is I did a FOIA, Freedom of Information request, to Oak Ridge and other DOE sites in the early 2000s, and it took them 4 years to give me the results. And I asked them for all of the documentation for materials that they had released from regulatory control because they were clean enough to not be regulated. We've stopped below regulatory concern 15 times in the US, but Tennessee is kind of the exception where they let it out. I have probably 3 or 4 boxes of information on how Tennessee, DOE in Tennessee let this stuff out. If you know anybody in Tennessee who might want them, I'm putting them into storage. I'm not getting rid of them, but I didn't get them till after my report was done. So I want to make that available. And then I've also done it around a few other sites, Los Alamos and Rocky Flats. If anybody else is from those areas and might want some of this.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think Jan put my website, that the contact form in there goes to my personal email. So
okay,
maybe the easiest way to reach out to me. So yeah, I would love to be in touch, and thanks for doing that work. People need to keep paying attention because it's not over.
You know anything about that landfill from more of a local perspective?
I followed some of it. It was kind of wrapping up, or like it was still. It's not in the book that much. I think I mentioned it a little bit at the end. It was not resolved then. So yeah, I tried to follow some of the local news about it, but I haven't been deep in there.
I wanted to say that Diane is in Nuclear Information and Resource Service, and she's been on these hustings for decades now. And so I really did want to get her comment before we had to close, but it is pretty late. And
Diane, I think you were out in Boulder lately, right?
Well, last July, we got Westminster County with Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice organized. Stop that community from connecting a hiking trail through Rocky Flats.
Oh, yeah.
Mountains. And now Boulder County's coming up next.
Diane, I'm sure you know Kristen Iverson's book, Full Body Burden. Yeah. She might, if you're looking for contacts with Rocky Flats, she would be the one I would reach out to.
Okay, thank you.
She's very
the
lovely.
plutonium that killed my mom in 1957 and 58, she was probably exposed in 58 when we first moved to Denver. The fire was in 57. That fire in Kristen Iverson's book That fire was not revealed to the public until 1969,
Yeah.
the year she died in Seattle of leukemia. Sure, I can't prove it. She died of plutonium. My dad was flying bombing missions over Italy, you know, but my mom was just a mom.
Yeah. Well,
And she left a 5-year-old.
I think we need to close our session now, and I'm going to turn it back over to David Kraft so that he can bring it to a close. And thank you
And I'm so glad
much.
you brought up Diane because I wouldn't have otherwise.
I agree with you, Lynn. It was important to have Diane's contribution. And I want to thank all of you people for coming and for staying, and especially Emily Strasser, who stayed till the last. So anyway, it's time for David to talk.
Thank you, Jan. And Emily, we really appreciate all you did tonight. It was an incredible presentation. And I would ask if you would stick around after we close down just for a couple of minutes. We would like to discuss something with you. Thank you. Thank all of you for attending tonight. I would remind you again, we'll be back next month on February 27th. And unless the Chinese DeepSeek destroys the entire nuclear industry, we'll be discussing the effects of AI and data centers and cryptocurrency on the inflated use of energy here in the United States. So we hope you'll be able to join us at 7 o'clock on February 27th for that. We invite you to bring friends and guests along with it as well. So thank you all for joining tonight. We appreciate all you do, and we hope you'll come back next month.
And thanks everyone for all of your questions. And I wasn't really able to keep up with the chat. So if you were trying to tell me something and you want to reach out, feel free to reach out through my website. So.
And I should also mention, we will be sending the chat to everyone who attended tonight. And if those of you who want access to the video of this, you have to write NEIS directly, and we'll get the URL out to you. So thanks again for attending. We look forward to seeing you next month.
The second for me to finish communicating with someone on the chat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.